You know, I miss the mistakes, the pratfalls, the bloopers that would happen in live worship all the time when we would gather. There's something about digital worship that loses that spontaneity, but when you're in a live worship service with tons of people involved and trying to follow a liturgy, mistakes happen all the time. I used to always skip over accidentally parts of the service. You remember that. And people in the pews would try to catch my eye, and they'd be pointing to the bulletin and we'd all be smiling and laughing. There's something about mistakes that can actually refresh things. Or do you remember, were you here when I came up on the chancel in my robe to start a great worship and my toe caught the edge of my robe and I fell flat on my face? Do you remember that? 600 people in the sanctuary all gasped. And I was fine. I hopped back up and then everyone was laughing and cheering. It was sort of like Chevy Chase's entrance onto Saturday Night Live. If you get that reference, you have to be at least 50 years old. I miss the mistakes that could happen live. Digitally, everything is so maintained and precise. I mean, about the worst thing that could happen on the internet is a bad camera angle. And really, a super bad camera angle is not that funny. Bring the camera back down, Mindy. I loved it in live worship. Those mistakes, they made the moment real. About the worst thing I could do right now is misspeak. I mean, I'm coming to you live, but misspeaking is what human beings do. We don't say things perfectly, ever, to one another. I miss the fun mistakes in worship. You know, we have a contemporary worship called 1159, and do you know in that service we crank tunes over the speakers really loud as people are gathering right up to the start of worship. And one week I was cranking a great old rock song from The Who. Who Are You? I love that song. Who are you? Who? Anyway, we're cranking that song, and I'm coming up to start the worship, and Roger Daltrey is screaming, and Pete Townsend is laying down those cool guitar riffs, and John Entwistle, the bass line, and Keith Moon on the drums. And I forgot right as that song is cranking up that Roger Daltrey drops an F-bomb. I didn't remember that, so I'm coming up front. I stand up in front right when Roger Daltrey screams, "Who the bleep are you?" We may have been the only worship ever to start with an F-bomb. And I just stood there and said, well, there you go. And we laughed together. And, you know, a cuss word doesn't have to ruin Christian worship, but it was just so funny. I miss the bloopers. There's a big blooper right now that's not very funny. We're not able to worship. What a blooper. Churches in America can't gather. There are 370,000 churches in America. Every weekend, more than 50 million Americans would gather together, and now we can't. That's a big pratfall. I think it has serious consequences. There's something about worship that's so essential to being a Christian. Do you know the word church in Greek is ecclesia? And that doesn't mean a building or a place. Ecclesia means an assembly. There's something sacred about the act of gathering, and we can't do that in the same way right now. The great sociologist of religion, Emil Durkheim, he had a theory that all of religion has its beginnings in that act of gathering. He thought that religion goes back to our tribal roots when we were hunters and gatherers, and how we would spend most of the day in very mundane, arduous tasks, hunting and gathering. But then when the tribe would come together, it would shift into the sacred. He thought that coming together created what he called a collective effervescence. So you moved from the profane or the mundane into the sacred. There's something about gathering that is so essential. And now we're having to learn to gather in a different way digitally and create that same collective effervescence. I think at this moment, worship itself is under evolution and change in America. And while it's so hard we can't gather, I think we're learning new things. Let's consider some of the basics about worship. Now, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, there's a word that's used again and again for worship. It means simply to lay down, or to bow down to a higher power. In the New Testament, when it becomes a Greek word, it's proskuneo. Proskuneo also means exactly the same thing, to bow down. And it's used often when people bow down to Jesus and recognize a higher power. But interestingly, nowhere in the New Testament is a worship service described at all. Now, the essential characteristics are there. The Lord's Supper is instituted, and it speaks of singing songs and gathering, but there's no worship services at all. But there's one place in John chapter 4 where Jesus talks about worship specifically, proskuneo. He's talking to the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. And at one point he says, in essence, there will come an hour, there will come a time where you will no longer worship at the temple or a specific place, or a church, but you will worship God in spirit and truth. I feel like he's talking to us right now. Believe me, there will come an hour when we can no longer gather at church this hour, but we must come to worship God in spirit and truth, to begin to grasp that worship is bigger than just a worship service. It's a type of attitude or approach to life itself. Believe me, the hour has come. We don't know history very well, and there's a fascinating history about worship in the Christian church that might surprise you. It was never actually very common for Christians to gather for worship at church. You might not know that, but we don't know history very well. We don't know American history very well. There's a famous essay that came out a couple of years ago about 10 things you really need to know about American history, because we don't know that much or remember much. There was a survey done recently of some basic questions about the United States. And get this, only 18% of college graduates could answer any of these questions. Who is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court? Who was the father of the Constitution? How long is a term in the Senate and in the House? Only 18% of college graduates could answer any of those. I know you're probably sitting on your couch wondering what ones you know. But those gotcha questions, it's kind of contrived. If you caught me off guard, half the time I think Ben Franklin was once president of the United States. I mean, those little gotcha questions don't mean much. If you asked me who's buried in Grant's tomb, sometimes it would take me a little bit to get there. But it would serve us well to know history a little better. Let me tell you some interesting history. Christians didn't typically gather for worship in a church. Remember, the first 3 centuries, we were an illegal religion. You wouldn't build public buildings and have big gatherings when you're an illegal religion. So for the first few hundred years, until Constantine, the Roman emperor, converted to Christianity and we became a public manifestation, an official religion. So remember, the first centuries, we didn't have big church gatherings. And then even when we did, not as many people worshiped as you might think. You know those great cathedrals in Europe? People imagine there was a time that they were full and lively, and now they seem so barren, and they lament that. Those cathedrals were never filled with regular worshipers. You see, during the week, the cathedrals in Europe were used to store animals. They would have food markets. People would come to the cathedrals at special times. They would come occasionally, but not weekly. Christian worship weekly in a church is not as historically common as you think. In the 1700s in America, only about 10% of Christians would go to church. 10%. In the 1800s, only about 20% would go to church. Why? Think about it. before cars, before central heating, would you walk 10 miles and then sit in a building that has no heating in the middle of winter or sweltering with no air conditioning? It was actually some technologies, the car and central heating in the late 1800s and cars in the 20th century, that now church going became very common for Christians, and it got to over 40% of Americans would worship in churches. But for most of history, the Christian faith, it was embedded in our lives, in the lives of villages and in our culture. The Christian church wasn't the place where Christianity happened. Christianity happened in your heart. It happened when a grandmother would share a story about Jesus to a grandchild, when families would pray at dinner. It happened in the collective life of the village and the town. Churches as a special place to go be a Christian, that's a historically recent development. Maybe we could learn from this. You see, things are changing right now. Maybe right now we could learn to reintegrate the faith more into our own lives. Church isn't supposed to be a special place you go to be Christian. You're to be Christian here. And worship is an attitude about life itself, a reverential, humble, proskuneo, bowing down in humility to the beauty of others and of life. Believe me, the hour is coming where we will have to worship God in spirit and truth, not at a particular place. Jesus is talking to us right now. We need to grow in the worship of God in spirit and truth. What's the spirit of worship? Spirit of worship is any moment that you grow in love. That's the essence of worship. Any moment in life, wherever you are, if you're growing in love, if you're taking hold of love, that's the reverential attitude. Worship God in spirit and in truth. Right now, those peaceful protests on the streets, protesting injustice, that's worship. That's worship in the truth, because there is a deep truth that racism is embedded in our culture, that there is systemic injustice. So right now on the streets, people are worshiping. They're worshiping God in spirit and truth. Let's go to the essence of what worship is about and reclaim it. When we worship God, we remember not to worship anything else. Oh, this is one of the key important aspects of worship. It relativizes all other powers. When we bow down, proskuneo, when we bow down to God, it means we bow down to nothing else, be that governments or notions of success or ideologies. To worship God is to be clear that nothing else is to be worshiped. Human beings are made to worship. If we don't worship God, you'll find something else to bow down to. You will. Be that some, again, notion of success or some idea or some power or government. Reclaim again what worshiping God in spirit and truth is. Wherever you are right now, wherever you will be each moment of this coming week, worship. Worship God in spirit and truth. Amen.